Hi guys, Happy New Year and welcome to the first episode of What in the World podcast for the year 2024. I'm your host, Raisa Ganji, and More in the World podcast would like to dedicate this episode to all the lives lost and affected in the recent conflicts around the world. Our heart goes out to the victims and the survivors. With the recent conflict of Palestine and Israel, otherwise known as the Siege of Gaza, it has been laid out for the whole world to see what goes on in a war. From the countries involved and in support of, and the countries against genocide, the people affected and the bystanders, both the involuntary and the voluntary bystanders. We're all witnesses of human atrocities, especially with social media and ongoing technological advancements. It is no secret that the world is governed by loads of varying factors. However, each with its own varying hierarchical value on the extent of power. When a conflict is addressed, it is usually addressed irrespective of the people who are involved in that conflict. Basically, political collateral damage. From the lives lost to the victims suffering from PTSD, to the environmental and the infrastructural damage caused. It's important to understand that people are elemental to what makes a society. They are elemental to economics, elemental to politics, elemental to the environment. They are elemental to a revolution. You can only go so far before you piss people off enough to initiate a revolution. And let me tell you that we can see people are pissed. With so much evidence of what is happening in Palestine and in Ukraine and in war-stricken areas all over the world, people are still in denial despite the evidence portrayed by social media. There's a recent statistic that says that the damage caused to Palestine due to this conflict has caused significant damage to not only crucial communication infrastructure but to living spaces, threatened food security, and made the area much more climate vulnerable. This goes for all war-stricken areas as damage continues to occur. Moreover, it is important to stress that this conflict has caused the Palestinian economy to drop so low that it would take till 2094 for Palestine to come back to its economy of 2022. War affects everything and everyone in its way. Political collateral damage. People form the fundamental aspect of society, and society is responsible for normative structure, from norms in politics to environmental structure. And hence, the targeted destruction of the society destroys everything. And the only way to destroy a nation is by destroying its people, evidently so. Everything from water systems to air systems, food systems, economical systems, environmental systems, communication systems have all been destroyed. And so, only one thing can be guaranteed with war: destruction. Environmental destruction is an obvious collateral damage of war. Referring to the United Nations, note to correspondence, a joint appeal by the UN Secretary General and the President of the International Committee of the Red Cross on the use of explosive weapons in cities, published in the year 2019. Quote, "The massive destruction caused by armed conflicts in cities can set development indexes back by years and even decades. This is a major setback to the achievement of many of the Sustainable Development Goals. Progress gained over decades can be quickly reversed as once lively and prospering population centers turn into ghost towns. Not only are people's lives at stake, but the environment that allows people to live and flourish in is also at stake. Adverse environmental impacts due to war cause an adverse impact to people's livelihood. Adverse environmental impacts include the risk of people from debris, harmful chemicals and toxins, industrial leaks, radiation, chemical spills, fuel leakages, spontaneous or consequential fires, ground contamination from ruined industries, contamination of fresh water reserves, damage of wastewater sanitation units, destruction of energy reserves, pollution, and so much more. It is important to note that environmental destruction is not only limited to observable damage or observable destruction, but also cumulative damage. Realistically speaking, if you were to evaluate, how long do you think it would take war-stricken areas or war-stricken countries to come back to the economy or come back to the environmental state that it was in pre-war? The weapons used in war can range from chemical and biological weapons to explosive weapons that are just dropped from drones or helicopters or GPS missile targets. Weapons used in war can range from the controversial use of white phosphorus bombs in heavily populated areas, which according to international law is prohibited. And Israel still continues the use of white phosphorus bombs. Bunker buster bombs, which are basically designed to penetrate deep walls before exploding. And lastly, hunger. Yes, hunger is also a weapon. All these weapons have the ability to cause widespread environmental damage, either directly or indirectly. When I stress on cumulative damage, the effect any war has on today's climate vulnerable world is drastic. War impacts the climate crisis and the environment in more ways than one. Militaries consume fossil fuels, and from our previous episodes, we know that fossil fuels contribute to the large amounts of greenhouse gases that are released into our atmosphere every year. And we also know that because that's a dangerous amount, that is why we have exacerbated global warming and climate change occurring. According to The Guardian, the world's militaries contribute to 6% of the greenhouse gas emissions produced every year. And this is only the reported data by many governments. Dr. Stuart Parkinson, the executive director of the Scientists for Global Responsibility, also went on to say to The Guardian that these military figures are hidden under normal government expenses. And so for like military aircraft, it could be hidden under aviation. Military tech industry could be hidden under industry, and military bases under public holdings, and so on and so on. He went on to further say that not only are people unaware, but the policymakers and even the scientists and the researchers involved in this are unaware the government hides their budgets and their costs. Defense ministries of core countries such as the US, the UK, Switzerland, and much more consume the most fossil fuels amongst other government agencies in their countries. As more countries worldwide dedicate their budget to militaries, the fossil fuel consumption rises, whether in conflict or not. And so active warfare would only maximize the amount of greenhouse gases and fossil fuel consumption done by militaries. In a reference to a study in 2012 by Iran Faitelson et al., I hope I'm saying his name right, on climate change and security in the Israeli and Palestinian context, the Middle East is among the least stable and most fragile regions, hence making Palestine, Israel, and the whole Middle East for that fact, a very climate vulnerable area to begin with. Faitelson also goes on to say that implications of conflict and climate change will reduce freshwater availability in Palestine and reduce their ability to produce normatic domestic water needs, whereby reallocation of water should be done by Israel in order to address the environmental needs of Palestine, whereby he goes on to say that it is unlikely that climate change will directly impact a conflict. It definitely didn't stop it. In a first-of-its-kind research done by researchers in the US and the UK, whereby the data was exclusively shared to The Guardian, it was revealed that in the first 60 days of the conflict since the 7th October 2023 attack by Hamas, it has been estimated that over 281,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide has been generated by the Israeli aerial bombardment and ground invasion. This research, however, is yet to be peer-reviewed. It is true that the climate costs of the first 60 days of Israel's military response was burning 150,000 tons of coal. The conflict itself in the first 60 days has generated a carbon footprint of more than 20 of the most climate vulnerable countries in the world, for which they produce in a year combined. That's crazy. That's a crazy amount of a carbon footprint to have in just 60 days. And you know what's the funniest part of it all? Is that almost half of the climate footprint said to have been released by Israel was actually due to US cargo planes, as they were flying military supplies into Israel in support of their side of the conflict. This study only comes amid growing calls for greater accountability of military greenhouse gas emissions, which, as thoroughly described, plays an outsized role in climate crisis, but are largely kept a secret and unaccounted for in the annual UN climate negotiation meeting. Benjamin Neymark, a senior lecturer at Queen Mary University of London and co-author of this very research, said that this study is not only a snapshot of the larger military blueprint of war, a partial picture of the carbon emissions and wider toxic pollutants that will remain long after the fighting is over. It is due to this environmental exceptionalism that allows countries to continue to pollute and produce greenhouse gas emissions without the fear of prosecution, further solidifying the supposed lack of fear with committing war crimes, as evidenced by the events that followed after the ruling of the International Court of Justice. This needs to stop, as countries need to take responsibility and tackle the climate crisis with accountability. In addition to the immediate suffering, the world is in a climate emergency, and that goes far beyond the carbon dioxide emissions produced from planes and bombs. However, it really brings up the question, to what extent do international conferences on climate change impact the decisions of countries? Tune into the next episode where we highlight this in much more detail and Tanzania's involvement. I'm Raisa Ganji, your show host, and see you next week. And once again, we would like to end this episode with the victims and the people affected from the conflict in mind.